a 747 cargo jet, cruising at 35,000 feet over the Indian Ocean. Then, without warning, the entire rear section just falls off. Mid-flight, the plane splits in half like a snapped pencil, and 159 people plunge into the darkness below. No survivors. No black boxes recovered. And for decades, one of the most disturbing aviation mysteries ever recorded. This is the story of South African Airways Flight 295. And trust me, it only gets weirder from here. November 27th, 1987. A Friday night at Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport. It's humid, sticky, the kind of night where your shirt clings to your back the second you step outside. South African Airways Flight 295 sits on the tarmac, a Boeing 747 Combi. For those who don't know, a Combi isn't your standard passenger plane. It's a hybrid. Half passengers, half cargo. The back section? A massive cargo hold separated by a firewall bulkhead. Tonight, 140 passengers are seated up front. And not just any cargo. The manifest lists electronics, computer parts, clothing, and various other goods being shipped from Taiwan to South Africa. Sounds innocent enough, right? But here's where things get interesting. Or suspicious, depending on how you look at it. South Africa in 1987 was under heavy international sanctions due to apartheid. Arms embargoes were in full effect. And yet somehow South African Airways planes were making regular cargo runs through Asia. Coincidence? We'll come back to that. The crew that night consisted of Captain Dawie Uys, a veteran pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. His first officer, Captain Cobus van Zyl. Flight engineer, Amos Maysella, and a full cabin crew to manage the passengers. By all accounts, this was a routine flight. The 295 was scheduled to fly from Taipei to Mauritius, where it would refuel before continuing to Johannesburg. Total flight time? About 13 hours. The kind of overnight haul where passengers settle in with blankets and eye masks, hoping to sleep through the boredom. At 11:50 p.m. local time, Flight 295 pushed back from the gate. It was airborne, climbing into the night sky over Taiwan. The weather was clear. No storms, no turbulence warnings. Everything was textbook normal. The passengers probably thought this would be one of those forgettable flights. The kind where you wake up at landing and barely remember taking off. They were wrong. For the first few hours, everything went exactly as planned. The 747 leveled off at its cruising altitude, heading southwest across the South China Sea. The cabin lights were dimmed. Most passengers were dozing off or watching the in-flight movie. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with drinks and snacks. Captain Uys and First Officer Van Zyl were chatting in the cockpit, probably discussing the usual topics. Weather ahead, fuel consumption, maybe plans for their layover in Mauritius. Then, at exactly 12:52 a.m., just over an hour into the flight, something changed. A call came from the back of the plane. One of the flight attendants reported seeing smoke in the rear cabin. Not just a little haze. Actual smoke. The kind that makes your throat tight and your eyes water. Captain Uys asked for confirmation. The attendant confirmed, yes, definitely smoke. And it was getting thicker. Now, smoke on an aircraft is the stuff of nightmares for pilots. It doesn't matter if you're flying a Cessna or a jumbo jet. Smoke means fire. And fire on a plane 35,000 feet above the ocean? There's no pulling over. No calling the fire department. You deal with it yourself. And you deal with it fast. Captain Uys immediately grabbed the PA system. His voice came over the speakers, calm but firm. He told passengers to remain seated and follow crew instructions. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the crew began running through emergency procedures. They checked the fire detection systems. Nothing. No alarms. That should have been reassuring. But it wasn't. Because the smoke was real. The flight attendants could see it. Passengers could smell it. At 12:56 a.m., just 4 minutes after the first smoke report, Captain Uys made a decision. They were diverting. Immediately, the nearest suitable airport was Plaisance International Airport in Mauritius. Still over 1,200 miles away. In aviation terms, that's not exactly next door. That's roughly a 2-hour flight under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. The crew initiated an emergency descent. The 747 began dropping altitude, heading toward Mauritius as fast as safely possible. Captain Uwais radioed air traffic control, declaring an emergency. His voice was steady, professional. No panic, just clear communication. "We have smoke in the cabin. We are diverting to Mauritius." Back in the cabin, things were getting worse. The smoke wasn't just lingering near the rear bulkhead anymore. It was spreading, moving forward through the passenger section. Some covered their faces with blankets or shirts. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, trying to keep everyone calm, distributing wet towels. But you can hear it in the cabin crew's voices when they communicated with the cockpit. This wasn't minor. This was serious. At 1:08 a.m., 12 minutes after the initial smoke report, Captain Hughes was still in contact with air traffic control. He updated them on the situation. The smoke was worse. Much worse. But here's the thing. The crew still couldn't locate the source of the fire. The cargo hold fire detection system showed nothing. The passenger cabin showed nothing. It was like fighting a ghost. Then at 1:12 a.m., the situation went from bad to catastrophic. The last transmission from Flight 295 crackled over the radio. Captain Yu's voice, strained now, reported an explosion. Nothing. Silence. Air traffic control tried to re-establish contact. "South African 295. Do you copy?" No response. They tried again. And again. Nothing. The blip on their radar screen, the tiny dot representing 159 human lives, simply vanished. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Ships were diverted. Aircraft were scrambled. The search area was roughly 140 miles northeast of Mauritius, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. For days, boats and planes scoured the water. They found debris, seat cushions, luggage, pieces of fuselage, body parts. The wreckage was scattered across miles of open ocean, and it painted a horrifying picture. This wasn't a controlled water landing. This wasn't even a crash in the traditional sense. The plane had broken apart in midair. The 747 had literally split in two at altitude, and everyone had fallen into the ocean from 35,000 feet. The impact with the water at terminal velocity would have been devastating. No one stood a chance. Over the following weeks, recovery teams pulled what they could from the ocean. They recovered about 20% of the aircraft. They found human remains. They found personal belongings, wedding rings, passports, children's toys. But they never found the black boxes. Not the flight data recorder. Not the cockpit voice recorder. Both were lost somewhere in the depths of the Indian Ocean, probably buried in sediment or scattered among the wreckage in water over 2 miles deep. Without those black boxes, investigators had to piece together what happened using fragmentary evidence. Maintenance, records, air traffic control recordings, the physical wreckage itself. And what they found raised more questions than answers. The official investigation, led by South Africa's Department of Transport, concluded that the cause of the crash was an uncontained fire in the cargo hold. According to their report, the fire generated intense heat, weakening the aircraft's structure, until it catastrophically failed. The plane broke apart, they said, due to the structural damage caused by the fire. Case closed. Except, not really. Because here's where things get extremely suspicious. The cargo manifest for Flight 295 listed mostly harmless goods, electronics, textiles, computer parts, standard stuff. But multiple sources, including investigative journalists and aviation experts, have suggested that the real cargo was far more dangerous. Some believe the plane was carrying illegal arms shipments, which was under an international arms embargo at the time. Others have speculated about toxic chemicals, ammunition, or even radioactive materials. Why would they think that? Well, for starters, several witnesses reported seeing unusual activity around Flight 295 before it departed Taipei. Cargo being loaded under heavy security, sealed containers that weren't listed on the official manifest. And then there's the smoke itself. Multiple survivors from the cabin crew, before the final moments, described the smoke as having a strange, acrid smell, not like burning plastic or electrical fire. Something chemical. And here's the really disturbing part. In the years following the crash, several people connected to the investigation died under mysterious circumstances. A cargo agent in Taiwan who handled shipments for South African Airways died in a suspicious car accident. A South African defense official who reportedly knew about secret cargo operations committed suicide. Or so the official reports claimed. Another investigator involved in the case was found dead in his home. Cause of death listed as natural, but his family disputed that. Coincidence? Maybe. But it sure makes you wonder, especially when you consider that the South African government at the time was actively involved in covert weapons programs. They were developing their own military technology, circumventing international sanctions, and they needed to get materials in and out of the country somehow. What better way than to use a national airline with regular cargo routes through Asia? Let's talk about the fire itself for a moment. Aviation fires are terrifying, but they're not usually catastrophic within minutes. Modern aircraft have extensive fire suppression systems, especially in cargo holds. Halon gas, temperature sensors, automatic extinguishers. The 747 was designed to contain cargo fires for hours if necessary, giving the crew time to land safely. So how did a fire in the cargo hold of Flight 295 become so intense, so fast, that it caused the plane to break apart in mid-air within 20 minutes? That's the question that haunts investigators to this day. Standard cargo, even if it catches fire, doesn't produce that kind of heat that quickly. But certain military materials do. Incendiary devices, white phosphorus, magnesium. These substances burn at extremely high temperatures and are nearly impossible to extinguish. If Flight 295 was carrying something like that and it ignited, the results would be exactly what we saw. Rapid, intense heat. Smoke that overwhelms the cabin. Structural failure. Catastrophic breakup. And here's another interesting detail. After the crash, South African Airways changed its cargo handling procedures. They implemented new security measures. They restricted what could be loaded onto passenger flights. Why would they do that if the crash was just caused by, say, faulty wiring or a random fire? It's almost like they knew something specific caused the disaster and wanted to prevent it from happening again. The families of the victims have been fighting for answers for decades now. They've demanded a new investigation. They've called for the wreckage to be recovered from the ocean floor. They've accused the South African government of covering up the truth. And honestly, can you blame them? Your loved one dies in a plane crash, and the official explanation is vague. The evidence is incomplete, and people connected to the investigation keep dying mysteriously. That's not conspiracy theory territory. That's legitimate suspicion. In 2006, nearly 20 years after the crash, a South African filmmaker named David Forbes released a documentary about Flight 295. He interviewed former intelligence officers, cargo handlers, and aviation experts. And multiple sources told him the same thing. The plane was carrying illegal weapons. The fire started because something in that cargo ignited, and the South African government covered it up to avoid an international scandal. One former South African defense official, speaking anonymously, claimed that Flight 295 was transporting components for South Africa's covert nuclear weapons program. Now that might sound far-fetched, but remember, South Africa did have a nuclear weapons program in the 1980s. They successfully developed several nuclear devices before dismantling the program in the early 1990s. So the idea that they were secretly shipping nuclear materials through civilian airlines isn't as crazy as it sounds. But here's the problem with all these theories. Without the black boxes, without a complete wreckage recovery, without transparent cooperation from the South African government, we can't prove anything definitively. It's all circumstantial evidence, anonymous sources, and speculation, which is exactly what happens when governments prioritize secrecy over truth. The families don't get closure, the public doesn't get answers, and the conspiracy theories multiply. Let's get back to the technical side for a moment. The Boeing 747 Combi that served as Flight 295 was a relatively new aircraft. It had only been in service for about 6 years. It had passed all its safety inspections. There were no known mechanical issues. The crew was experienced and professional. By all standard metrics, this should have been one of the safest flights in the sky that night. And yet it ended in catastrophic failure. That tells you something. Either there was a massive undetected flaw in the aircraft, which Boeing and regulators would have caught in subsequent investigations, or something aboard that plane created conditions that no amount of engineering could withstand. something that shouldn't have been there in the first place. The location of the crash also matters. The Indian Ocean, 140 miles northeast of Mauritius, deep water, remote. Even today, with modern technology, recovering wreckage from that depth would be incredibly difficult and expensive. Back in 1987 it was nearly impossible, which again is awfully convenient if you're trying to hide something. The ocean becomes a very effective disposal site. Evidence sinks, secrets stay buried, and the truth gets diluted in 2 miles of dark water. There have been calls over the years to mount a proper recovery operation, to bring up the black boxes, analyze the wreckage more thoroughly, and finally get some definitive answers. But those calls have gone nowhere. The cost would be enormous, millions of dollars for what might ultimately be an inconclusive result. And the South African government, both during apartheid and after, has shown little interest in reopening the case. Draw your own conclusions about why that might be. What makes this crash particularly haunting is the speed. 20 minutes. That's all it took from the first report of smoke to complete destruction. 20 minutes for 159 people to go from a routine flight to a nightmare. Some of them probably never even knew what was happening. The passengers in the front of the plane, farthest from the cargo hold, might have just noticed smoke starting to appear before everything went dark. Others, closer to the source of the fire, would have experienced hell. Heat, smoke, panic, and then the violent breakup of the aircraft. It's the kind of death that nobody deserves, especially not as collateral damage in some government's illegal weapons operation. The crash of South African Airways Flight 295 remains one of the most controversial aviation disasters in history. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Not because the investigation was thorough, but because it was suspiciously limited. And not because the evidence points to a clear cause, but because the evidence keeps suggesting something far darker than anyone wants to admit. A 747 doesn't just split in half over the ocean for no reason. Fires don't burn through reinforced bulkheads in minutes, unless something seriously volatile is involved. And people connected to sensitive government operations don't just happen to die in convenient accidents. So what really happened to Flight 295? We may never know for certain, but the pattern is clear enough. A plane carrying suspicious cargo catches fire. The fire is intense and fast-spreading, beyond what normal materials would produce. The aircraft breaks apart catastrophically. The government investigation is limited and vague. Key evidence is never recovered. Witnesses die mysteriously. The truth is still buried somewhere in the Indian Ocean, along with the wreckage and the bodies of 159 people who deserved better. That's the crash of South African Airways Flight 295. A mystery, and quite possibly, a cover-up.